Welcome to MMAPlay365. I'm Newsome and I'm here for a special episode of the podcast talking about max bets. Now, we've got no UFC this weekend, so there's no fights to break down, no predictions to give. So within these breaks with the UFC, I have started trying to give you guys something a little bit different, an educational piece, and ultimately a special episode of the podcast, and something just different from predicting fights and, you know, breaking down and analyzing fights as well. So as I've already mentioned, for this week, we're going to be talking about max bets. Now, the reason I'm talking about max bets is because it is something that I have been asked over the last few years about why I don't play many max bets, or why am I bets normally below 3 units? Why are they never really higher than 3 units typically on any given fight card? And I think it was only last weekend or the weekend before that one of our subscribers at MMAPlay365 asked the same question again. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk about max bets and, you know, why they are quite rare from my perspective and why you should be careful with max bets. And to be honest with you, when I was actually doing the research and preparing the podcast, I mean, I don't read from a script, but I do have some information, statistics and things that I've dug from my own record over the last 6 years. I was actually quite surprised with what I've found, and there's a reason that the max bets are rare and that I don't play them very regularly, and I'm going to be covering all that in this podcast. But going into the basics of max bets, and maybe this is the first time that you've turned up to this channel, or maybe you're a new handicapper and you're wanting to learn more about the terminology and the things that we say when we're making bets. So in regards to a max bet, it's known as a bet that the maximum amount of money that you would have on one particular fighter on one particular event. So, for example, if you were betting fighter A, a max bet could typically be 5 units. Now, there is a couple of instances in this podcast, two instances actually, that I've gone above 5 units, which again, I don't think, now knowing what I know, was the best way to go about it. But again, we're going to cover that a little bit later. But yeah, a max bet typically is 5 units. And that's the maximum that you'll bet on one fighter on one particular fight card. Now, in regards to the measurement of units, so as handicappers, we don't say, oh, I've bet £1,000 on this fighter, or I've bet €1,000 or $1,000 on this fighter, whatever your currency is. We typically say we'd bet 1 unit, for example. And 1 unit is 1% of your bankroll. So a bankroll would be the amount of money overall total that you've got set to one side for betting purposes, to make bets, to put the money back in. And the goal as a professional gambler is to keep growing that bankroll, growing the bankroll. The bigger the bankroll you've got, the more your unit amount is going to be, because like I said, it's 1 unit typically is 1% of your bankroll. Now, that bankroll could be money that you've got set in one particular book that you just keep betting on. It could be a bankroll that you've got set in a separate bank account, or it could be a big boatload of cash inside your house, which, you know, it's not my preferred method, if I'm being honest, but whatever works for you. So your bankroll overall is the money that you've got set aside for betting purposes only. And like I said, if you bet 1 unit on a fighter, that's 1% of that total bankroll. So if that bankroll is £100,000, dollars, euros, or whatever it is, and you bet 1 unit, that would be £1,000, dollars or euros. So that's how the unit measurement and the bankroll works together. And it just enables you to be very conscious about money management and being smart about what you're betting as well. You know, you're not betting your money for bills or food or whatever you do, you know, in your personal life or with your family. You know, bet responsibly, bet smart, and that's one of the best ways to do it, just to have that little bit of money aside, just to make sure that you are betting within your means and what you can afford to bet as well, and what you ultimately can afford to lose. But anyway, moving on to the max bet. So as we've already mentioned, the max bet, typically 5 units, that'd be 5% of your bankroll as the maximum that you would bet on one specific fighter on one specific event. Now, for me, my overall tracked and verified record on BetMMA.tips is over the last 6 years. I have been betting for more than 10 years now, but I officially started tracking and recording what I was betting 6 years ago in 2017. So this episode and the max bets are based on that over the last 6 years, which you can find all on the MMAPlay365 Bet MMA Tips profile. And like I said, I found some really interesting things. So the first thing is over the last 6 years, I've actually only bet 10 max bets. So it's a nice round number to work from. And some people bet max bets every weekend, or, you know, maybe less frequently, but more often than what I bet them. And that's fine, each to their own. But actually, I'm very cautious with the way I max bets, with the way I place max bets. And also I've got a certain criteria as well that has to hit every single criteria in order for me to place a max bet, because 5 units is a lot of money on one specific fighter. And if you lose that fight, and remember, this is mixed martial arts, one punch can change the course of a fight or ultimately change the fight and the fight. So you have to be really careful in regards to, you know, putting 5 units on one specific bet, because it's a big loss to take on one fight. So you've got to be really sure. In my opinion, you've got to be really careful. And this is why, for me, max bets are quite rare. And I'm going to go through all the max bets that I've played. I'm going to tell you how much I've obviously bet on them. Like I said, there is a couple that have gone over 5 units, how much that I've won or lost, and, you know, go over the overall results. So I'll jump straight into that now. And the last max bet that I actually played was early last year, February the 6th, 2021, Alexander Volkov versus Alistair Overeem. And I played Volkov at minus 175. That was 5 units. I profited 2.86 units in that fight. And Volkov won that fight easily. You know, he won the first round. You know, he was making his reads in that first round. He landed a couple of shots. Overeem did land one hard punch on Volkov that, you know, when you've got 5 units on a fighter, you feel everything that's coming back on your fighter as well that you've got 5 units on. But aside from that one big punch that actually didn't really trouble Volkov at all, Volkov really steamrolled that fight. And, you know, my analysis and the way I broke that fight down, in my opinion, was perfect. It was on point and it justified a 5 unit bet. And again, I'll touch a little bit on that specific bet later. But yeah, Alexander Volkov versus Alistair Overeem, February the 6th, 2021. And minus 175 on Volkov, profit of 2.86 units. And the max bet before that was actually the year before, so February 22nd, 2020, and that was Xiaonan, who we're actually going to see next week against Mackenzie Dern, versus Karolina Kowalkiewicz. Now, Karolina Kowalkiewicz was on a massive decline in that fight, and it showed, you know, Xiaonan was a minus 250 favourite, at least that's what I got her at. I think she did go up to like minus 275, but again, that was a 5 unit bet at minus 250, the profit of 2 units, plus 2 units there. And the decision, like I said, was easy. It was a simple fight. You know, she wasn't in any danger, any trouble. So again, it was a good max bet. My analysis was good with that one also. Now, the one before that was actually 2 years prior. And again, you can see a pattern here of these max bets not being very rare. And that was October 6th, 2018. And it was Alexander Volkov versus Derrick Lewis. I bet Alexander Volkov at minus 162, a 5 unit bet. That ultimately lost. Now, this is one that I do feel a little bit hard done by, if I'm being honest, because it wasn't a judge's decision or anything like that, but Alexander Volkov was comfortably winning the fight. He was absolutely smoking Derrick Lewis everywhere the fight goes. Even earlier in the fight, in the first couple of rounds, he had opportunities where he could have, you know, potentially put his foot on the gas a little bit more and got a finish when Lewis was hurt. But, you know, Volkov's style is quite patient and picking him apart. And like I said, he won round 1, he won round 2. There might have even been a 10-8 in there as well. He was winning round 3 until it hit 11 seconds to go before the end of the fight. And like I said, Volkov was winning easily, but he came in for an exchange, left his chin in the air, and Derrick Lewis does what Derrick Lewis does and landed that big bomb. And ultimately, it was the beginning of the end of the fight for Alexander Volkov. With 11 seconds to go, it stings a little bit having a max bet. I don't regret that max bet because the fight was going exactly how I predicted it to go. It's just the danger on the other side, especially at UFC heavyweight, in the UFC heavyweight division, especially when your name's Derrick the Black Beast Lewis. You've always got run that risk of the big hard shot landing. And if it had landed in round 1, I could have taken that a little bit easier. But the fact that it was 11 seconds away, you know, it's a tough one to take. But ultimately, it's a 5 unit loss on a max bet. Now, the pattern that you're going to see here is the max bets are going to start coming a little bit thicker and faster between the dates. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But we've got August 25th, 2018, so the same year as the Lewis and Volkov bet. And the max bet was actually on Drew Dober against John Tuck. Drew Dober minus 187. And that was a win, and it was a comfortable win as well. And again, typically, I don't think it was one of those fights that, you know, a lot of people bet on Dober because he was a near 2-1 favourite, and John Tuck was, you know, at that point, Dober and Tuck, it was, some deemed it a relatively close fight, but I thought it was a stylistically great fight for Dober, which it showed. And that was, like I said, a 5-unit bet with a profit of 2.67 units, with Drew Dober winning an easy decision, a 10-8 in there as well at minus 187. Now we go to the next one, again in 2018, February 24th. And this is the one that, out of all the max bets, this is the one that I'm disappointed with the most, because in my opinion, in hindsight now, looking back at it, it was a stupid bet. And, it was one that, there's no defending it really. There's no other way of putting it. It's one that's definitely up there with one of the worst bets that I've ever made in the 10 plus years that I've been handicapping. And that was Mike Perry versus Max Griffin. Now, not only was this a 6-unit bet, so this is one of the occasions where when I went above the 5 units, because I was at the time that confident in Mike Perry winning this fight, and I didn't really give Max Griffin enough respect, or any respect at all, especially when it came to the betting line. But Mike Perry, was minus 256, which again, that's a betting line that's way too wide. Obviously, hindsight is all good and everything, but it was a line that was way too wide for a fighter like Mike Perry against a fighter like Max Griffin. But at the time, it didn't feel like it, and I bet more than 5 units. It was a 6-unit bet, and ultimately it was a 6-unit loss, and Mike Perry was beaten easily by Max Griffin as well over 3 rounds. I think there was a 10-8 round in there as well for Max Griffin. So again, it's not one of the best bets, and it's up there with probably one of the worst, and especially with it being a 6-unit bet as well. So I'm always transparent. I never hide from losses, and I'll always tell you when I win as well, of course. And the fight before that is January 20th, 2018. Again, so you can tell I was betting a lot of max bets in 2018, and I do believe that I was still in a bit of a learning curve then, in my opinion, in regards to still figuring out my style and growing as a handicapper, developing. And this was, again, a bet that was more than 5 units. It was 6.5 units. So from a unit perspective, this is the most that I've ever bet on a single fight. And it was Daniel Cormier versus Volkan Oezdemir. Daniel Cormier was minus 256. Now, this is one that, this is one that I don't actually regret betting 6.5 units. And the reason I don't regret betting 6.5 units is because not only was this a ridiculous mismatch, Volkan Oezdemir was getting, although he was an underdog and a relatively sized underdog, he was still getting way more respect on the betting line than what it should have been against Daniel Cormier, who was a former champion, double champion, and now a Hall of Famer, elite wrestler, good striker, difficult to beat. So at minus 256, I thought that it was a steal on Daniel Cormier. 6.5 units, it won easily as well. Cormier finishing via ground and pound in round 2 after a comfortable round 1. And Volkan Oezdemir really didn't have anything for Cormier. And that was one that, I think a lot of people expected, me included. Obviously, I bet 6.5 units on that, but the profit was 2.54 units on that bet. Now, the next one, we're going into 2017 here, December 9th. Davi Ramos versus Gruetzemacher, minus 260 on Davi Ramos. It wasn't an easy fight, this. Davi Ramos did end up getting the finish in round 3, so it was a winning max bet, but it wasn't simple. Like, there was definitely some struggles, and the minus 260 line post-fight definitely didn't look reflective of how the fight played out, but it was a win nonetheless, and it was a 1.92 unit win on that 5-unit bet from Davi Ramos. Staying in 2017, November 4th, Joanna and Jedrzejczyk versus Rose Namajunas 1. Minus 300 on Joanna and Jedrzejczyk, and this was a loss. This was a 5-unit loss. This was the one where, Rose Namajunas shocked the world, shocked me as well, if I'm being honest. And it's not one that I regret, though, because at minus 300, we're getting into that territory where Joanna and Jedrzejczyk was just that dominant that, if she'd beaten Rose Namajunas in that fight, we'd have been looking at minus 400, minus 500, maybe even wider, like we do with Amanda Nunes fights and Valentina Shevchenko fights now. So I don't regret that bet. And like I said, nobody knew that was going to be Rose Namajunas' time, apart from obviously Rose and her team and the people around her. But yeah, that was a loss, a 5-unit loss, not one that I regret. But yeah, a loss nonetheless. Moving on, And we've got September 16th, 2017, Luke Rockhold versus David Branch. Now, I bet Luke Rockhold at minus 208, and this was one of the bets where I think it did go to like minus 350, minus 400, if I remember correctly. I got it at minus 208. The line got released early in the UK. At this point, I wasn't charging for bets or anything like that. So, you know, I was able to get that nice early line with the money that I needed on that fight. At 5 units, minus 208, I thought that Luke Rockhold was just, that was at a time where Luke Rockhold was a really good fighter, to the point where, you know, you're starting to look at this championship potential, and he's a very difficult fighter to beat. So minus 208, I thought there was a lot of value there. 5 unit bet that ultimately did win. It was an easy win, ground and pound finish round 2. And the profit on that was 2.4 units from that 5 unit bet. And finally, we get to the 10th max bet, actually my first ever max bet, and it was on Colby Covington in June of 2017, June the 17th. Colby Covington versus Hyun Kim. Colby Covington was minus 200, 5 unit bet. The profit on that was plus 2.5 units. I thought it was an easy bet to make. Colby Covington was that fighter that was coming up. I think people had really just started clocking onto it. That's why we got a minus 200 and not a slightly better line. But he was still relatively questionable to some people, but his relentless wrestling, it was obvious that at this level against Hyun Kim, and even though Hyun Kim's a veteran and, you know, a legend in the UFC, at that point, it was always going to be Colby Covington's night, and it was an easy decision win. And again, profit plus 2.5 units from my 5 unit bet. And that's the 10 max bets that I've played on my tracked record at MMAPlay365 over the last 6 years. So what this looks like as an overall and as a total. So I actually won 7 of those max bets. I lost 3, which I think at 70%, that's a decent return on the max bets. But this is where the numbers get a little bit shocking. So the wins totaled plus 16.89 units, which is great. 16.89 units from 7 wins is really great. However, the 3 losses, and this is where it gets really, really interesting, the 3 losses was minus 16 units. So the total units spent across the max bets was 52.5 units. The total profit was only plus 0.89 units with a return of investment of 1.70%. So this is where it's shocking, this is where it's surprising, but there is a reason for it. So it's shocking and surprising because, you know, out of those 10 max bets, I only lost 3. I only lost 30% of those. But yet, because those are max unit bets and I'm betting 5 units and obviously the 6 unit bet as well, when you do lose a max bet, it's very detrimental to, and there's a big deficiency in your win-loss on either that night or across this long term. And that's where you've got to be careful, because it's great winning a max bet, but ultimately if you win a max bet, and again, typically a max bet, you are playing those plus 200 lines, those plus 300 lines and everything in between. That's where your max bets typically fall into, because you want to put as much money on as you possibly can to get as much back from the fighter that you're really confident in. But the problem is, like I said, if you put one max bet on at 5 units at minus 300, and you win, that's great. But then if you lose your next max bet, you're then down across those 2 max bets. So this is where you've got to be really careful. And this is one of the reasons why I tell people that max bets are really rare from my perspective, because you look at those numbers that I've just stated and you look at my year to date now. And again, I know there's a different metric here, and there's a different time difference between all those max bets over the last 6 years and then 1 year. But my year to date now, my total's plus 45.90 units with a return of investment of 29%. Total spent this year is 159.5 units. So again, I know there's a difference here between the max bets and the years to date, but the reason why I'm getting the return of investment that I am now is because I'm putting a lot of focus into the underdogs and where the bookies are actually getting that wrong, opposed to looking at the biggest favourite on the card, for example, and just looking to max bet that fighter. And there's a real difference between, you know, going with max bets constantly on every single fight card and actually going a little bit lower with your units, so going 1.5 or going 2 units on a good underdog, because that good underdog long term is going to return more profit and a bigger return of investment than what max bets is over a long period of time. And I think my record proves that as well. And like I say, that's the reason why with my max bets, they are rarer, and I created some certain criteria that a fighter, if I do max bet, has to fall under every single criterion. The opponent also has to fall under every single criteria as well for that to even be considered as a max bet. So the criteria, I'm actually going to run through this with you. Now, the first one is a fighter who can finish. You know, you need, if you're putting a max bet on, you need to make sure that your fighter can find that finish, whether that be knockout power, whether that be good grappling game, a dangerous submission game, or a mixture of both. A fighter who can cruise to a decision. You know, we're in the UFC, at the highest level of mixed martial arts, finishes don't come as easy. If your fighter doesn't find a finish or can't find a finish, can they easily cruise to a decision? Are they a good round fighter, point fighter, being able to secure those rounds and win 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 5? And the next thing on the list, a fighter whose cardio will hold up. So you've got to make sure that your fighter is not going to gas out. So over 3 rounds or over 5 rounds, whichever one they're fighting, you've got to make sure that your fighter's got the cardio to go hard for those 3 rounds. And I'm not saying hard as in 100%, a million miles an hour, but just be able to fight comfortably at, you know, a good pace without being tired, without losing gas in your tank, and be able to do that for the course of the fight. Then you've got to have your fighter who can eat a punch. So a fighter that's got a decent chin. Again, it doesn't need to be an iron chin, but it's definitely not a glass chin. You know, you've got to be confident that your fighter can take what's coming back from them, from their opponent, and be able to sustain enough damage to be able to still come forwards and not be deterred and win the fight. Of course, this is mixed martial arts, 4-ounce gloves, 1 punch in the right spot can end no matter what fight or what weight division. But again, just typically your fighter's got to be able to take a decent shot, and a fighter who can defend a takedown. So this is crucial as well. If you are max betting a fighter, you've got to make sure that they've got some takedown defense, that they're not going to be stuck on the back. There's nothing worse than having money on a fighter that you're just watching, you know, drain away as the minutes tick on, as the rounds go by, just because they're getting, you know, just smothered on top and they're laying on the back and not being able to do anything. A fighter who can stand back up to the feet if they are taken down. So again, this is martial arts. Takedowns can happen. If your fighter does get taken down, can they spring right back up? Do they have a good defensive jiu-jitsu game to be able to cause that a scramble, or be able just to get back up to the feet, separate and get back to it? So again, that's another crucial one. Now, after that, you're looking at the dangers on the opposite side. So you've looked at your fighter, you've got everything checked off, your fighter's looking great from this perspective, but it's really key that he or she is going to be able to beat their opponent. So you've got to look at the opponent's side as well. So can the opponent take my fighter down? You know, is it a relentless wrestler? Is it a fighter that's just going to rinse and repeat? If it is, then I'd probably stay away, or in fact, I'd definitely stay away. But can they take him down? If they can't take him down, that's great. Or if they are going to be able to take him down, can they hold my fighter down? If they can't take him down, or if they can take him down but they can't hold him down, then again, I know that my fighter's not going to get smothered from a bottom position. So again, this is looking great from a max bet perspective at this point. And the next one, this is an important one as well. Can the opponent out-volume my fighter? And like I said, if a finish doesn't happen, and if the fight is on the feet and they're striking and they're getting at it, if my striker is getting outworked and getting hit more often than he or she is hitting back on their opponent, then again, that's going to be a detriment to the max bet as well. And that's going to definitely be something that you need to look for in regards to that volume. You've got to make sure that your opponent isn't likely going to out-volume your fighter that you've got a max bet on. Does the opponent have fight-ending power? So if the opponent does have fight-ending power, now this is one that's a little hit and miss, because I'm not saying that I would ever be completely deterred away from a max bet if they do have fight-ending power, because a lot of fighters do. But if it's like an Ngannou, where literally like just being able to tap you and really change the course of a fight from potentially even a jab, is something that I would definitely stay away from. If they've got that scary power, then it's just something you've got to take into consideration. So if they don't necessarily have fight-ending power, and they just have that puncher's chance that every fighter in MMA and the UFC has, then again, that's fine. Does the opponent fight at a higher pace? So if the opponent's got pressure, aggression, and they're really pushing the pace and they can do that, for example, a Ricky Simone or a Merab Dvalishvili, if it's that type of fighter that just fights at that crazy pace, they're probably going to outwork your fighter that you've got a max bet on, and you don't want that. So that's enough criteria as well. Is the opponent in their prime? Now again, this is a hit and miss one. I'm not saying that I would never bet against a fighter in a max bet just because they're not in their prime, or I wouldn't bet them because they are in the prime. You know, fighters have a good prime over a number of good years. So it's not necessarily one, but it's definitely one to take into consideration on the flip side, because if the fighter's not in the prime and if they are declining, then this can just add to the confidence of the max bet. And again, if they are a fighter that's had the wars inside the cage, that is at the tail end of the career, that is looking a little less durable and a little slower and a little worn, then again, all this sort of stuff really helps when it comes to that confidence of laying that 5-unit bet down. And finally, what do I cap the fighter at? So I said earlier I was going to talk about the Volkov betting line at -175 a little bit more, and I'm going to use that as an example here. Volkov, I actually capped at -300 against Alistair Overeem. I thought he should have at least been -300 in that spot. Now, odds implied on -300 is 75% predicted probability that he's going to win the fight. But the books actually had Alexander Volkov at around -175, where I bet him, and the odds implied on -175 is 63.64%. So actually with that bet, I had an 11.36% edge over the bookies from where I capped it, from where the bookies were giving the odds. And anything, 10% is a really good edge to have over the bookies. In some cases, 5% edge is fine too, but 10%'s a bit of a holy grail, if I'm being honest. But then, like I said, for this bet, I was getting an 11.36% edge over the bookies. So for me, it was a really good max bet to play, one that played out exactly how I anticipated it. And all the criteria that I've just read out, Volkov hit all that criteria, Overeem hit all that criteria, and it just made it, I'm not saying I wasn't nervous for when Volkov was fighting. Like I said, you will feel everything on your fighter, but it was definitely a fight that, again, was just comfortable for Volkov, so it was a good max bet. And like I said, from the criteria, you've got to be able to get a good percentage edge over the bookies to be confident in putting that 5 units on as well. So that's the special episode done and dusted. Probably a little bit longer than what I wanted it to go on for, but again, I really wanted to get into the details about why the max bets are rare, why I would rather look for an underdog with a lower unit amount, because the return of investment's better, because again, long term, you definitely, if you're doing your analysis right and your reads are really good and you can really play this MMA handicapping game to a high level, then you are going to make more money from underdogs long term than you are just max betting a fighter that's -200, -250, -300 or more, or whatever that looks like. But like I said, I hope this has been an educational piece to some. I hope, again, you've enjoyed the special episode podcast. I did get some really good feedback from the Underdog Hunters podcast that I did a few weeks ago when there was no UFC. So again, I'll continue to do these on the UFC breaks. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you all learned something. If you've got any questions, if you've got any comments, just drop them in. I will reply to you. Aside from that, I'm Newsome. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again next time.